4. A routine review of a Victorian-era photograph unexpectedly led to one of the most remarkable discoveries in the study of women's history in 19th-century America. What started as a typical cataloging task at a Boston auction house became a 4-month investigation that stretched across 3 states and eventually uncovered a forgotten network of courage that had remained hidden in plain sight for more than 137 years. The photograph itself had survived over a century, stored away in the attic of an old textile mill owner's mansion in Lowell, Massachusetts. When the estate was finally sold after years of legal disputes, its contents were sent to various auction houses and antique dealers throughout New England. Among hundreds of items was a single framed family portrait dated 1887. At first, it seemed completely ordinary. 7 people were arranged in formal Victorian clothing, their expressions serious and composed as was the standard for the period. Dr. Emily Richardson, a curator at the Massachusetts Historical Society specializing in 19th-century social documentation, had seen thousands of similar photographs over her 15-year career. Studio portraits from the 1880s followed strict rules-specific poses, careful arrangement of family members by status, and an overall sense of order and seriousness. That rainy afternoon, as she processed items for an upcoming exhibition, Richardson almost cataloged the photograph without giving it a second thought. But something made her hesitate. Perhaps it was the unusual way one woman held her hand, or how the light highlighted a small detail. Richardson took out her magnifying glass and leaned closer. What she saw made her pulse quicken. The woman seated on the left, appearing to be in her mid-30s with dark hair and a high-collared dress, had her left hand placed in a way that seemed unnatural for a formal portrait. Her hand rested on her lap, but 3 fingers were extended in a precise pattern while her thumb and index finger touched at the tips, forming what looked like a deliberate symbol. Richardson's breath caught. In all her years studying Victorian photography, she had never seen a hand gesture like this in a formal family portrait. These photographs were carefully planned, expensive, and rare. Every detail was intentional. Random hand positions simply did not occur. If this gesture was there, it had to mean something. It was deliberate communication frozen in time, waiting for someone to notice. Richardson spent the rest of the afternoon examining every part of the photograph. The back of the frame provided the first clues. A small, yellowed label torn in places bore the printed text Whitmore Studio, Lowell, Mass. 1887 in elegant Victorian lettering. Below it, written in faded ink, were the words, "The Harrison Family." With this information, Richardson began investigating who these people were and what the mysterious hand gesture might signify. The next morning, she visited the Lowell Historical Society, a modest brick building housing city records, business directories, and extensive documentation about the textile industry that had dominated the area during the 19th century. Within hours, Richardson had identified the family. Thomas Harrison appeared in the 1887 Lowell City Directory as the owner of a moderately successful dry goods store on Merrimack Street. The 1880 census listed him, his wife Catherine, and their 3 children. The household also included Catherine's unmarried sister, recorded as Eleanor Parker, age 34. Richardson's excitement grew as she compared the photograph to the census data. The woman with the unusual hand gesture matched the description and age of Eleanor Parker. But the census revealed something more. Eleanor was not listed as keeping house, as was typical for unmarried women at the time, but as a seamstress. This was significant. In the 1880s, seamstresses often worked long hours in massive textile mills employing thousands, mostly young women from farming families or new immigrants seeking independence. Richardson requested access to employment records from the Boot Cotton Mills and the Lawrence Manufacturing Company, 2 of Lowell's largest textile operations of the era. What she discovered painted a grim picture of industrial life in the 1880s. Workdays lasted 12 to 14 hours, conditions were dangerous, wages barely covered basic needs, and workers, especially women, had almost no legal protection. Accidents were frequent, illnesses common, and those who complained were at risk of immediate dismissal. But Eleanor Parker's name did not appear in any of the mill employment records. Instead, Richardson found something even more intriguing. Ella Lanner was listed in the records of St. Anne's Episcopal Church as a visiting nurse, providing care to mill workers' families. This role would have allowed her access to many homes, intimate knowledge of families in distress, and a level of trust and freedom unusual for a woman of her time. Pieces of the puzzle were coming together, yet Richardson still did not know the meaning of the hand gesture. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While researching women's organizations and charitable societies of the Victorian era, she found a reference in a scholarly article about reform movements in industrial cities, published in 1998. The article noted that some women's aid groups in the 1880s developed discreet signals to identify safe houses or trusted people without alerting hostile authorities or abusive family members. The article cited a collection of personal letters at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard University. Richardson immediately contacted the library and arranged to view the letters. 3 days later, she sat in a climate-controlled reading room, carefully turning fragile pages of correspondence between women involved in what they called protective work, efforts to help women and children escape abusive households and exploitative labor conditions. One letter dated March 1886 and written by a woman named Harriet from Lawrence, Massachusetts, included a rough sketch in the margin. It showed a hand with 3 fingers extended and the thumb and index finger touching, exactly like the gesture in Ella Lanner Parker's photograph. Below the drawing, Harriet had written, "Remember our sign, 3 for the Trinity of safety, shelter, sustenance, and secrecy. The circle means our network is unbroken. Show this to any woman in need, and she will know you are a friend." Richardson leaned back stunned. This was not a random pose or a photographic accident. Ella Lanner Parker had deliberately included a coded message in a formal family portrait, a signal marking her as part of an underground network dedicated to helping vulnerable women and children. The fact that she had incorporated this symbol into a professional studio portrait, paid for by her brother-in-law, was both bold and ingenious. But why take such a risk? Family portraits were expensive, cherished items, often displayed prominently in homes for visitors to see. If someone recognized the gesture, Ella Lanner could face serious repercussions. Victorian society did not look kindly on women who defied traditional family roles or helped wives leave abusive husbands. Richardson needed to know more about Ella Lanner Parker herself, her motivations, and the dangers she faced. She returned to Lowell and began searching for personal records to build a fuller picture of Ella Lanner's life. Church registries, property deeds, newspaper archives, and court documents slowly revealed her story. Ella Lanner Parker was born in 1853 in rural New Hampshire, the youngest of 5 children in a farming family. At 19, she had married briefly to a man named David, but records from Hillsborough County Courthouse show the marriage ended after 18 months. The record noted, "Petition for separation granted due to cruel treatment." In the 1870s, divorce was scandalous and extremely difficult to obtain, suggesting the abuse must have been severe and well documented. This personal experience likely fueled Ella Lanner's commitment to helping women in similar situations. After her separation, she moved to Lowell to live with her sister Catherine and brother-in-law Thomas. There, she trained as a nurse through St. Anne's Episcopal Church, part of a growing effort to provide medical care to industrial workers and their families. By 1880, Ella Lanner made regular visits to tenements and boarding houses throughout Lowell's Mill District. Richardson found multiple mentions of her in church minutes and local newspapers. She was publicly praised for her devotion to charitable work and Christian service among the poor, but reading closely and cross-referencing records, Richardson realized these activities often covered more sensitive work, helping women and children escape abusive homes and exploitative employment. Ella Lanner's role as a visiting nurse gave her the perfect cover. In the 1880s, these nurses moved through working-class neighborhoods, immigrant tenements, and mill districts with freedom and trust, allowing them to offer help without drawing suspicion. Mill workers' boarding houses, giving basic medical attention to families who could not afford doctors. This allowed Eleanor to reach the most vulnerable groups in Lowell, families struggling with sickness, injuries, unemployment, and the everyday hardships of industrial life. She saw firsthand the heavy toll that 12-hour workdays in unsafe factories took on women's bodies. She noticed children working in mills when they should have been in school. She encountered women trapped in marriages where physical abuse was treated as a private matter beyond the reach of the law. Richardson observed that Eleanor's nursing visits often lasted much longer than what was medically necessary, and she frequently returned to the same households multiple times. These habits suggested something beyond ordinary healthcare. She was forming relationships, earning trust, and quietly offering help to women who desperately needed support but had nowhere else to turn. Equipped with Eleanor Parker's name and knowledge of the secret hand gesture, Richardson extended her investigation beyond Lell. She contacted archives, historical societies, and university libraries across Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, requesting searches for similar photographs from the 1880s and 1890s that might show the same gesture or slight variations. Responses began arriving within weeks, and they were astonishing. A small museum in Providence had a cabinet card photograph from 1889 showing 3 women at a church social, one of them subtly displaying the 3-finger gesture. The New Hampshire Historical Society discovered a family portrait from 1891 where an elderly woman's hand formed a similar pattern. The American Textile History Museum in Lowell had an image from 1888 of workers standing outside a mill. On close inspection, Richardson noticed 2 women in the back row with their hands arranged in the familiar sign. Each find led to more questions and deeper research. Richardson started compiling a database of these women, recording their names, locations, jobs, and family connections. A pattern appeared that was both remarkable and heartbreaking. Almost all the women were linked to industrial work as seamstresses, mill employees, domestic workers, or laundresses. Many were unmarried, widowed, or, like Ella Lanner, separated from their husbands. They lived in cities and towns across New England where textile mills and related industries employed large numbers of working-class women and children. Richardson found references to these women in unexpected places. Church meeting notes occasionally mentioned them offering Christian charity to struggling families. Local newspapers from the 1880s and 1890s sometimes noted their participation in temperance groups or moral reform clubs, socially acceptable public faces for women's activism. Yet the evidence indicated these public roles often concealed more delicate work. What made Eleanor Parker's network unique was its sophistication and secrecy. Unlike more visible reform organizations, this network functioned almost entirely unseen, using coded signals, trusted contacts, and careful discretion to avoid drawing unwanted attention. The hand gesture and photographs served several purposes. They identified network members to each other, documented their commitment for the future, and created a permanent record that could not be easily destroyed or denied, unlike letters or spoken accounts. Richardson uncovered evidence that the network ran several safe houses in Lell alone, modest homes and apartments where women and children could stay temporarily while arrangements were made for more permanent solutions. These locations changed often to avoid detection, and they were maintained through small donations, volunteer work, and the personal resources of women committed to this mission. As Richardson's investigation deepened, she began to appreciate the clever strategies Eleanor and her network used to operate under the watchful eyes of a society that would have condemned their work. The most striking part was how they concealed their efforts within respectable Victorian social structures, church groups, sewing circles, charitable societies, that no one would closely scrutinize. Eleanor's position in the household itself offered protection. As an unmarried woman living with her sister's family, she was expected to contribute through domestic labor and answer to her brother-in-law. Thomas Harrison, Richardson discovered through business records and letters, was a progressive merchant who supported temperance and education for working-class children. While there was no proof he knew the full scope of Eleanor's work, he clearly allowed her significant freedom to pursue nursing and charitable activities. The timing of the 1887 family portrait held special meaning. Richardson learned it was taken just 3 months after a terrible fire at a Lell textile mill that killed 7 workers, including 3 young women. The disaster triggered public outcry and demands for safety reforms, yet little changed. After the fire, Eleanor and her network intensified their efforts, aiding victims' families and helping workers find safer jobs. The photograph, Richardson realized, was Eleanor's quiet act of defiance and documentation. Unable to speak publicly about her work, unable to openly defend the women she assisted, Eleanor had created a lasting record of her commitment. The hand gesture was her signature, a testament frozen in time that would endure for over a century. Richardson found that other women in Eleanor's network had done something similar, embedding the coded gesture in family photos, wedding portraits, and even funeral cards. It was as if they understood that history might forget their efforts, their achievements could be erased or dismissed, and they wanted to leave a visible trace of their contributions. The danger Eleanor faced by displaying the gesture publicly became clearer as Richardson uncovered evidence of opposition to women's reform work. Newspaper editorials from the 1880s condemned women who encouraged wives to leave their homes. Court records revealed cases where women assisting others to escape abusive marriages were sued for alienation of affection or accused of breaking up families. The social and legal consequences could be severe. To understand the full reach of Eleanor's network and its influence, Richardson moved beyond photographs and official documents. She searched for diaries, letters, oral histories, and personal accounts that might reveal the human stories behind the coded gestures and secret safe houses. This led her to descendants of women who had been helped by Eleanor and her network in the 1880s and 1890s. Through genealogical research and contact with local historical societies, Richardson identified families whose ancestors had links to Lowell's Mill district during that period. Many were initially hesitant to discuss family histories, especially matters involving domestic hardships or social stigma. Yet as Richardson explained her research and showed the photograph of Eleanor Parker, some began to share stories passed down through generations, often in hushed conversations or deathbed confessions. One woman, a retired teacher named Patricia, shared her great-great-grandmother's diary from 1889. The diary belonged to a mill worker named Anne, who arrived in Lell from rural Maine at 16 to work in the textile factories. Her entries described grueling conditions, constant fatigue, and barely enough wages to pay for boarding and food. But the diary also included a cryptic note from November 1889, "Met the nurse with kind eyes today. She asked about my cough but seemed to notice more. She made the sign of 3 in a circle and said, 'I have friends if I ever need help.'" Anne's diary revealed that several months later, after she was injured by machinery and faced dismissal without pay, Eleanor helped her find work as a domestic servant with a family in Worcester, far from the mills and the foreman pressuring her for favors. Anne eventually married, had children, and lived to 73. A long life compared with most mill workers who died young from accidents, illness, or exhaustion. Another descendant shared letters mentioning a safe house on Adams Street in Lowell, where women could stay if home life became unbearable. The letters never detailed what occurred there, but they praised Eleanor for her discretion and kindness. Richardson found that address and discovered it had been owned by a widow, Mrs. Whitman, who rented rooms nominally to boarders, though city records showed she never had long-term tenants. These personal accounts revealed the practical reality of Eleanor's work. Women and children who came to her were given immediate shelter, basic needs, and help finding longer-term solutions, new jobs, housing in different towns, and sometimes assistance with legal matters in extreme abuse cases. The network operated on trust, discretion, and dedication. The willingness of dozens of women to offer whatever help they could provide was remarkable. Richardson's research also revealed the personal costs that Eleanor and other members of her network faced because of their work. Victorian society had strict rules for women, especially those who were unmarried and relied on their families for support. Defying these rules, even for morally good reasons, came with serious consequences. In 1892, 5 years after the family portrait had been taken, Eleanor Parker's name appeared in Lowell court records in a troubling context. A man named Robert filed a lawsuit against Eleanor, claiming she had interfered in his household after she helped his wife and 2 children leave their home and move to Providence. The court documents included Robert's statement alleging that Eleanor had turned his wife against him and ruined his family without cause. Eleanor's own testimony, written down in the court clerk's careful handwriting, told a very different story. She described the bruises she had noticed while visiting the family as a nurse, children who flinched at sudden noises, and a wife who had confided her fear that her husband might one day kill her. The judge dismissed the case, noting that Eleanor had acted within her role as a visiting nurse concerned for the well-being of her patients. Still, the lawsuit had been reported in the local newspaper, and the public attention had caused damage. Some church members questioned whether Eleanor's work was suitable for an unmarried woman, and there was pressure on Thomas Harrison to monitor his sister-in-law's activities more closely. Richardson found evidence suggesting that this lawsuit and its fallout had forced Eleanor to become more cautious. After 1892, her name appeared less often in public documents and church records. Outwardly, it seemed she had withdrawn from visible charitable work, but cross-referencing other sources indicated that her actual efforts had not diminished. She had simply learned to carry them out more discreetly. The personal sacrifices were also clear in other ways. Eleanor never married, never had children of her own, and spent her adult life in her sister's household, relying on her brother-in-law's support. In Victorian America, this would have been seen as a kind of failure, a woman unable to fulfill society's expectation to become a wife and mother. Yet Richardson understood that Eleanor had made deliberate choices, giving up conventional success and security in order to pursue a cause she deeply believed in. Other women in her network faced similar hardships. Some were shunned by family members who disapproved of their work. Others lost jobs or homes when landlords or employers learned that they were helping women escape abusive marriages or exploitative workplaces. One woman, identified in photographs by Richardson, had been briefly jailed in 1894 for sheltering a runaway wife. The charges were later dropped, but she had spent 3 days in custody. These were not abstract risks, they were real dangers that these women faced every day. Eleanor Parker's final years were perhaps the most revealing part of Richardson's investigation. After the court case in 1892, Eleanor continued her work, but with much more caution. By the late 1890s, she was in her mid-40s and her health began to decline. This was not surprising given the physical demands of nursing and the stress of managing her secret activities. In 1899, Eleanor's sister Catherine died of pneumonia at age 46. The death certificate and church records documented a brief but rapidly progressing illness, leaving Thomas Harrison a widower with 3 adult children. Eleanor, as the unmarried sister, naturally remained in the household to help with domestic responsibilities. Richardson found that Catherine's death affected Eleanor in a deeper way than just personal grief. During the estate liquidation that had brought the 1887 photograph to light, Catherine's personal effects included several letters from Eleanor written over the years. These letters showed that Catherine had been aware of Eleanor's network work and had quietly supported it. Sometimes Catherine contributed financially from her household budget, sometimes she offered her home as a temporary refuge when other safe houses were unavailable. Always, she maintained complete discretion to protect Eleanor and the women she helped. One letter from 1891 was especially telling. Eleanor wrote, "Dear sister, I know the risks I take reflect upon your household and your children. If Thomas wishes me to leave, I will understand and bear him no ill will. But I cannot abandon this work. I have seen too much suffering, too many women with nowhere to turn, too many children trapped in circumstances beyond their control. If I do not help them, who will?" Catherine's response, written on the back of the same letter, was brief but powerful. "You will not leave. This is your home and your work is righteous work. Thomas agrees, though he worries for your safety, as do I. We are proud of you, Eleanor, even if we can never say so publicly." This exchange gave Richard's insight into the family dynamics behind the 1887 photograph. The portrait had not only recorded Eleanor's secret commitment, but had been created with her family's knowledge and quiet approval. Thomas and Catherine had allowed her coded gesture in the photograph because they supported her work, even if they could not openly acknowledge it. The photograph became both a personal testimony and a subtle family endorsement of her courage. Eleanor Parker passed away in 1904 at the age of 51. Her death certificate listed consumption, or tuberculosis, likely contracted during her years of nursing in crowded tenements and boarding houses. She was buried in the family plot at Lowell Cemetery, her gravestone simply reading Eleanor Parker 1853-1904. She served the suffering. In February 2025, 4 months after the 1887 photograph was rediscovered, Dr. Emily Richardson organized a public presentation at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Over 200 people attended, including historians, genealogists, descendants of Lowell mill workers, and members of the public fascinated by Eleanor Parker and her hidden network. Richardson displayed the original photograph, along with dozens of other images showing the coded hand gesture. She shared letters, court records, and testimonies revealing the scope and impact of the network, telling stories of women helped by Eleanor, including Anne, who escaped the mills, and the mother and children who fled to Providence. Countless others, whose names were lost to history, had their lives transformed by her courage and compassion. The presentation quickly attracted attention outside academic circles. Local newspapers reported on the story and several national media outlets followed. Descendants of women who had worked in the mills came forward with family stories and documents, discovering that their great-great-grandmothers had been part of Eleanor's network or had been aided by it. Some families even found photographs containing the same coded gesture, further proving the network's reach. The city of Lowell, which had long celebrated its industrial heritage and famous mill girls, began planning an exhibition focused on Eleanor Parker and the Women's Protective Network. The display would honor not just Eleanor, but all the working-class women who risked their safety and reputations to help others. Richardson continued her research, expanding into other industrial cities across New England and beyond. She found evidence of similar networks in Pennsylvania coal towns, New York garment districts, and Midwestern manufacturing centers. Photographs from the 1880s to the early 1900s showed the same hand gesture, suggesting that this silent form of communication and documentation was more widespread than previously known. The 1887 Harrison family portrait, once a forgotten attic relic, now hangs in the permanent collection of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Visitors study Eleanor Parker's carefully positioned hand, read about her life and work, and reflect on what it meant for her to document her commitment publicly despite the risks. For Richardson, the investigation became more than an academic project. It revealed a hidden chapter of women's history, a story of courage, solidarity, and quiet resistance that challenged traditional ideas of Victorian propriety and women's passivity. Eleanor Parker and the women in her network had not waited for society to change or for laws to protect them. They built their own systems of support, operating in secrecy but leaving traces for future generations to discover. The hand gesture in the photograph, once unnoticed, had finally been seen and understood. In that recognition, Eleanor Parker's voice, captured in silver and light for 137 years, was finally heard.